I'd like to welcome all of you to our very first virtual tour, which we decided to do early in the spring when everything was still closed down. I realize that Pennsylvania has started to open up now. We are still holding back and being cautious and probably will not have official tours until the fall. So I hope this tides you over. Until then, I would like to welcome you all to our first virtual tour at Nakashima's. In this video, I'll be talking about the life of my father and how we got to New Hope, which I hope you find interesting. It's quite an adventure. In the second video, we will give a more detailed tour of each of the buildings, and we want to show you a little preview of what those buildings will look like, and we hope you will tune in for the next installation of the Nakashima tours. Usually I start off the tour by giving a little background on George Nakashima, because there is some confusion among some people about whether he was Japanese or American. His parents came from Japan around the turn of the century, but he was born in the USA, so he was a full-blooded American, even though we were incarcerated during the war on the West Coast because of our bloodlines and because of racial prejudice. And unfortunately, that racial prejudice and violence is on the rise again. And we had hoped, the Japanese American community had hoped, that through the spreading of knowledge of the camps which the Japanese Americans were put into during World War II, that that kind of behavior would be understood and not repeated. But unfortunately, it is repeating itself, and we're very sorry to hear that. And the Japanese American community is certainly behind the attempt to turn the tide and to make peace in this world, and to realize that we're all one nation. And even though we are many races and many religions and many different backgrounds, we are all one nation under God, and we hope that that will continue to be that way. My father set up the Foundation for Peace in the mid-1980s primarily to build altars for peace in all the continents of the world. He built one that went to New York City in 1986, and we sent a second one to Aurobindo, India in 1996, and the third one to Moscow in the year 2001. And we do hope that their presence in different parts of the world is making a difference, and we need to continue our efforts for peace on many levels. The peace altars are just one level, and they will mean and function as different things in different continents. My father was born in Washington State in 1905. He had been a Boy Scout and did a lot of hiking on the Olympic Peninsula, and fell in love with trees and nature and the silence of being on the mountaintops all by himself. He went to the University of Washington and studied forestry for 2 years. Then he switched to architecture, because I guess he figured his employment opportunities were somewhat limited if he was in forestry. And he did so well in architecture that he got a scholarship to MIT. Actually, his first scholarship was to Harvard Graduate School of Design, which he thought was too impractical, and he switched to MIT and got a scholarship there instead, and graduated in 1930 at the height of the Depression, and eventually decided to sell his car and buy a steamship ticket around the world, because it was easier than trying to earn a living in the USA. So he went back and bummed around Paris for a while. Eventually got on his steamship and traveled to the land of his ancestors, and it must have been some kind of culture shock. I mean, he was in the whirling, crazy life of the bohemian artist in Paris in the 1930s, and he ended up in this almost medieval landscape in the land of his ancestors and the home of his ancestors near Tokyo in Japan. His father contacted him and said, "I think it's about time you got a real job." So he got a job with Antonin Raymond, the Czech architect who had studied with Frank Lloyd Wright and worked with him in Tokyo before he established his own office. And so Dad got to work alongside this new group of young architects who had studied the new technology of the 20th century, steel and concrete construction, and they actually brought that whole technology to modern-day architecture in Japan. And my father was very fortunate to have made friends there and remained friends with him throughout his lifetime. And by, I guess it's a quirk of fate, he was sent to India. Mr. Raymond got this job to do a reinforced concrete building in Pondicherry, India. And he needed an architect on site to help him with it. And Dad said nobody else volunteered, so he volunteered to go. Got on the boat and took this long journey to India in the 1930s. And he got there, and nobody had heard of reinforced concrete before. Nobody knew how to make it. Nobody knew how to form it, or they didn't even have the steel or the cement or the proper kind of sand to make some concrete. So Dad was not only architect on site, but he was general manager as well. And he learned a tremendous amount from that project. And it turned out that the mother of the ashram where this building was being built, her name is Mira did not care whether the building was done on time or on schedule, because she wanted it to be the most beautiful building possible. She wanted it to be like an Egyptian temple for the disciples of the Sri Aurobindo Ashram. And the other thing is that they were going to, Raymond and company thought that they should just bring in workers to get it done. And the mother of the ashram said no. She wanted the disciples of Sri Aurobindo to use it as a learning process, so that they would not only learn how to do reinforced concrete, but they would learn how to work together to subjugate their ego and to create something beautiful. And creating beauty was, in their estimation, a way of receiving transmission from the divine and translated it into the human world. During that period of time, he became so involved in the culture and the philosophy of Sri Aurobindo and his ashram, where the building was being built, that he became a disciple of Sri Aurobindo in 1938 and thought he was going to stay there for the rest of his life. Unfortunately, the war broke out, and he decided he better go back to the USA where his family was, and he stopped by Japan on the way, and by some other quirk of fate, met my mother, who had also been brought up in Seattle, but was returning from visiting her sister in Australia. So they fell in love, became engaged, and eventually both returned to the U.S., where they got married in California in 1941. During that period of time, he saw a Frank Lloyd Wright building under construction. He was trying to decide what he wanted to do next in his life, and thought he would probably be an architect, because that's what he was before. But he realized that the craftsmanship in the USA was so inferior to that in the Far East where he'd been working, that he decided to quit architecture and go into furniture. It was actually pretty gutsy. I mean, he hadn't studied furniture design per se. He'd done some work in furniture with Noemi Raymond while he was at the Raymond firm, but he decided to drop architecture as a profession and go into furniture. And he said to me later that it was the same as architecture, only smaller, and he could control it from beginning to end. And actually that makes it kind of complicated, because nowadays we still start out with the log itself. We buy the logs whole and mill them, and then we have to dry them and wait for the right client to come along and select each piece of lumber for each job individually, and then we design each piece of furniture individually before it goes into production. So it's a long process, which Dad initiated in 1941, and he was just beginning to roll along. He didn't have money to buy machinery, but he developed a friendship with the Father Leopold Tibesar, who was administering to the Japanese American community. He actually went with us when the war broke out in 1940. Well, it broke out in 41, but we were incarcerated in 1942. And Father Tibesar went with us. But before that, he had a boys' club in Seattle, and he wanted his young members to learn how to do woodworking. So Dad taught the young men how to do woodworking in exchange for his use of the machinery there. So He worked that out and did his first furniture in Seattle out of the Maryknoll Missionaries Boys Club. So we're very grateful. During that period of time, I guess Dad became a Catholic as well, and he did not receive instruction, but the priest said that he'd been a Catholic all his life and didn't need instruction. We went to Puyallup and eventually to Minidoka in Idaho on the desert. And there was a young man named Gentaro Hikogawa who had been a trained carpenter in Japan, and the two of them were given the job of trying to make our barracks more livable. So Dad papered our little apartment with old blueprints because he said there were supposed to be boards and battens on the barracks, but there were boards and no battens. So the desert winds blew through and blew sand in the cracks pretty extensively, so he covered the walls with as many blueprints as he had. It was the end of his architectural career. And then he worked alongside Gentaro Hikogawa, who was, apparently we were allowed to have hand tools. I don't think he had any machinery, but he was allowed to use hand tools, and he learned a great deal about Japanese joinery and Japanese hand tools during that period of time, and he was forever grateful to have the companionship of Gentaro Hikogawa and his skill set passed along to him. Dad's professor at MIT contacted the Raymonds, who had by this time left Japan and were living in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and he said, "Could you please sponsor the Nakashima so they don't have to stay in this terrible camp on the desert?" And so he did. And Dad came to Pennsylvania in 1943 and worked as a chicken farmer as long as he could stand it. And when the war was over in 1945, he went out and rented a little old cottage down the road from here and opened his shop and started a line of furniture working with Knoll Studios. And that introduction was made through Mr. Raymond. We're very grateful for that. And Dad wasn't sure that he wanted to be involved in mass production, but he did a lot of the prototypes. He did a lot of the early production for Knoll in his little shop on Aquatong Road. And then he found the site where we are now and convinced the farmer to loan him basically 3 acres in exchange for labor on his farm until he could pay off the price for 3 acres, which at that time was, I think, around $900. So Dad bought these he bartered, I guess, for the 3 acres of land and started to build his shop because he knew he needed an income in order to survive. Then he built the house afterwards. In the meantime, Mother and Dad and I lived in an old army tent. And there was a man who was living here. He was having trouble with his wife, and I guess he had an old army tent. And then he reconciled with his wife and left a tent behind, so we lived in the tent. And so that was our first home in Bucks County. And then eventually Dad built the house that was habitable. The first winter was not so habitable, so Mother and I went to California to visit her father, who was not going to survive much longer, so that was a good excuse to be in sunny California for the first winter. And he kept building. He finally finished the house. My brother came along in 1954, and he built on an addition to the house so that my brother could have his own bedroom, and he built the showroom in 1954. My Aunt Thelma, who was with us also when we were in camp when I was a baby, came and took care of my brother also. She didn't have any children of her own. She always considered my brother and me her children. She did indeed bring us up when we were very young, and we were very grateful to Aunt Thelma as well. She was also the office manager, so she set up the office and she took care of Kevin, and then Dad kept on building. built an addition onto the shop, and then he needed storage space for the lumber, so he built a building for the lumber. Then he decided he needed a room for the finishing. More importantly, then he needed the lumber storage, so he used the building intended for lumber storage as finishing, and then built another lumber storage building. And he kept on building. He built the Conoid studio. It was finished around 1959. Then after that, he built the pool and the pool house, which is not really necessary for the business, but Dad was on a kick about warped shell roofs. He built the chair shop next door, and he thought that was wonderful, and then he built this one, which is much bigger and reinforced concrete, and then he kept on building warped shells because he was just fascinated with the technology. And so he built the pool house in 1960, and in 1967 he built the HP shell on the arts building for Ben Shaw's gallery, and then his last building was the reception house, which he built in 1975, and he called it his swan song. The finest materials, and it was the one place on the property that had an electric dishwasher, so we didn't have to lug the dishes all over the property. He used to entertain in different places and different buildings, and somebody had to lug the dishes around and wash them afterwards, and it was nice to have one building where all the dishes were and they could be washed automatically. So that's kind of the history of Nakashima. In the meantime, Dad worked on different projects. He had developed a very loyal clientele, starting in Philadelphia, and there was a very loyal client who furnished an entire. First, they furnished their offices, their doctor's offices, and then their homes, all in Nakashima. And one of those clients had an entire house built, furnished completely in Nakashima, and the house burned down in 1989, just before my father's retrospective show opened in New York. And that was a devastating occurrence for them. I mean, the entire collection of all kinds of things burned to the ground. And she vowed that she was going to rebuild that building and rebuild all the furniture in it. So when my father passed the following year, in 1990, my father had started the project, and he promised this client that we would rebuild all of her furniture, but he passed away before it was completed. So that was my first training. I worked on her house for 3.5 years after my dad passed, and that was very good training. Probably the project he was most famous for was furnishing the house of Nelson Rockefeller in Pocantico Hills. There's debate about whether that house in Princeton or the house in Pocantico Hills had the most furniture, but they were both very special projects. And the house in Pocantico Hills was designed by Dad's best friend in the Raymond office, whose name was Junzo Yoshimura. They were really good friends. In the 1930s and the rest of their lives, they were friends. So that was kind of a sweet project for him to have completed. And we were sorry to have him go, but we've been able to keep going without him. There was one employee who came in the 1970s as a very young man because he loved woodworking, and he just retired after 50 years working here. And we kind of miss him, but there are other people who've stepped in to fill his shoes. And so far, you know, we're still trying to do everything the way Dad did. And whenever we get stuck, we sit and think, you know, what would George do? And then we try to do it as closely as he would have liked us to do. We feel like Dad's still watching over us. We're still working on his wood. We're still working on his inspiration. And it's not just inspiration of the design, but it's the way we work with wood. I mean, Dad felt that even when he was alive, we were working against the modern ethos of technology and mass production and trying to make as much money as possible. Through his experience at the ashram, it was more important to him to make something of quality than it was to make something, it was to make a lot of money. He says, well, you know, couldn't you do it with money? The best thing you can do is buy some beautiful wood or have some beautiful land and, of course, build beautiful buildings. So he lived his dream, and we hope to continue that dream into the future. And we're very grateful to have this opportunity to talk to you, even though we can't see you. And we look forward to when we are able to open up safely to the public again. So thank you for tuning in, and we hope to see you soon.